Charles walked into Windsor expecting a routine conversation about the future. He had no idea that, within minutes, he would be asked to imagine a monarchy in which Camilla no longer had an automatic place at its center. William and Catherine were already waiting. Between them sat a simple folder. Nothing about the room suggested a major confrontation. There were no raised voices, no accusations, and no dramatic demands. But the papers inside that folder carried an idea that could change what happens after every future royal reign. And the most surprising part was this. The rule would not be written only for Camilla. Catherine was prepared to accept it for herself. That detail would make it almost impossible to dismiss the proposal as a personal attack. The meeting took place at Windsor Castle on Thursday evening, August 13, 2026. Charles had been told only that William and Catherine wanted to discuss future transitions. At first, that sounded harmless. Royal transitions involve staffing, offices, communications, residences, and countless details that most people never see. But when Charles entered the private sitting room, he noticed William and Catherine were not treating this like an ordinary planning meeting. Catherine opened the folder. William did not. That alone told Charles something was different. The first pages did not attack Camilla. There was no criticism of her marriage, no demand that she leave the family, and no suggestion that she should lose her dignity or personal standing. Instead, the language was cold and administrative. One sovereign. One working family. One center of royal authority. The basic idea was simple. When one reign ends, the next reign should begin with a new sovereign at the center. The previous royal household would not automatically continue around the surviving consort. That meant no guaranteed second court. No automatic communications office. No permanent staff structure simply because those people had served during the previous reign. And no assumption that a residence connected to the old court would automatically remain a separate royal headquarters. Camilla could remain part of the family. She could continue her charitable work. She could attend family events. She could remain respected. But institutional authority would not simply follow her from one reign into the next. For Charles, this was already difficult to hear, because he knew exactly where the idea had come from. Catherine had been studying the history of royal transitions only days earlier, and one example had caught her attention: the Queen Mother. After the death of King George VI, Queen Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen Mother moved to Clarence House and remained one of the most visible members of the royal family for decades. She had staff. She had engagements. She had patronages. She had a public role. And Clarence House became closely connected to that role. For years, the arrangement had worked. But Catherine saw a question hidden inside that history. What happens when a system created for one generation becomes an expectation for every generation after it? That was the issue she wanted William to consider. She asked a simple question. If a surviving consort continued with a separate household, separate staff, communications, residences, and public duties, could that eventually create another center of influence beside the new sovereign? Individually, none of those things seemed dangerous. Together, they could become something much bigger. A second center of royal gravity. William understood the concern, but he was hesitant, because any decision that reduced Camilla's future role could easily be presented as revenge. Diana's name would return to the conversation. People could say William was finally settling an old family dispute. Catherine could be accused of pushing Camilla aside before she even became queen. William knew how quickly that story could spread. Then Catherine said something that changed the entire argument. If the rule was fair, she said, it had to apply to her too. William looked at her. She was serious. If William died before Catherine and George eventually became king, she would not expect George to create a second royal court around his mother simply because she had once been queen. She would remain George's mother. She could remain loved. She could continue supporting causes that mattered to her. But she would not expect to inherit the machinery of William's reign. That was the moment the issue stopped being about Camilla. It became a question about the monarchy itself. What belongs to a family? And what belongs to the institution? Those two things had often been mixed together. Catherine wanted them separated. Her argument was straightforward. A surviving consort should keep family status, personal dignity, and private interests. But institutional power should belong to the reigning sovereign. If the new king wanted a former consort to continue official duties, that could happen. But it should happen because the new sovereign invited them, not because tradition automatically required it, not because staff had already been working for them, and not because an old household had existed for decades. That distinction gave William something he had not had before: a principle. He asked advisors to examine it from every direction. What would happen to communications staff? What would happen to royal employees? Could former consorts continue public appearances without confusing who officially represented the crown? Could a royal residence remain connected to a former court without slowly becoming a second headquarters? The answers were not simple, and one residence stood at the center of the problem: Clarence House. For Charles, Clarence House was not just a building. It carried history. His grandmother, the Queen Mother, had lived there for decades. Charles had grown up seeing her remain a powerful and visible figure after her husband's reign had ended. To him, Clarence House represented something comforting. A widow could remain important. She could continue serving. She could have a household. And the end of her husband's reign did not mean the end of her public life. William's proposal challenged that assumption. Nothing would happen automatically, he argued. Not the residence. Not the staff. Not the office. Not the institutional role. Every part of the previous structure would have to be reconsidered when a new reign began. Charles understood what William was saying, but he also understood what it meant for Camilla. And that was where the conversation became personal. Part 2 of 3. Charles finally looked directly at William. Was this really about Camilla? William admitted that Camilla would be affected, but Catherine interrupted.
No.
That was not the same thing. The proposal was bigger than one person, and the second page of the folder would prove it. But before Charles reached that page, the conversation turned toward something even more uncomfortable: Camilla's future without Charles. Charles asked, in effect, what would happen if he were no longer there to protect her position. For a moment, the monarch seemed to disappear. There was simply a husband thinking about his wife. William's answer was calm. Camilla would not disappear. She would still be family. She could still have a public life. She could still support causes that mattered to her. But protecting someone did not necessarily mean preserving an independent royal institution around them. That distinction was at the heart of the entire proposal. Government and family were not the same thing. Royal authority and family affection were not the same thing. A person could remain deeply respected without automatically holding institutional power. Charles sat quietly. Then he asked the question everyone knew was coming. What about Clarence House? The room became still, because Clarence House represented the old model. For decades, it had been connected to the Queen Mother's public role. It had house staff, visitors, charitable work, briefings, and official activity. If William and Catherine truly wanted one working royal household, what happened to a residence that had historically supported another one? William did not pretend there was an easy answer. The residence itself would have to be considered as part of the transition. That was different from simply removing Camilla. The goal was not to take something from her. The goal was to stop assuming that the previous reign's structure automatically belonged to the next one. Charles understood the difference, but the emotional weight remained. He had spent decades waiting for the crown. Now he was being asked to imagine a time when his reign had ended, his life had ended, and Camilla's place in the institution would depend on the monarch who came after him. That was a future no husband wants to picture. Then Catherine spoke again, and this time, her words were even harder to dismiss. The same rule would apply to her. If William died first and George became king, Catherine would not expect George to maintain a separate court around her. She would not expect William's staff to continue working for her simply because they had served her for years. She would not demand an independent communications operation. And she would not expect her popularity to give her permanent institutional authority beside her son. She was asking the monarchy to accept a difficult principle. The next sovereign must be allowed to rule freely, even when the previous generation remains alive, even when that previous generation is loved, even when that person is the sovereign's own mother. Charles stared at her. There was no easy argument left. If Catherine was willing to accept the same limitation, it could no longer reasonably be described as a punishment designed for Camilla. That was exactly why Catherine had placed herself inside the rule. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. A child should not have to inherit both a parent's crown and a parent's power. For Charles, the meaning was clear. George would inherit the crown. He should not also inherit an older institutional structure that could remain beside him. The discussion then reached Camilla herself. She entered the room and immediately sensed that something had changed. William explained the proposal carefully. He did not begin with her title. He began with the future. When the next reign eventually began, William and Catherine wanted one major working household centered around one sovereign. Camilla listened. She understood the implication quickly. So, what happens to me? The answer was not that she would disappear. She would remain family. She could continue charitable work. She could attend family occasions. She could appear publicly if the reigning sovereign wanted her there. But official representation would come through the new sovereign's household. The employees serving the working monarchy would answer to the reigning monarch. Communications would run through the new court. And official duties would require an invitation rather than an automatic right carried over from the previous reign. Camilla's concern was obvious. Did that mean she vanished the moment Charles was gone? William answered no. Losing automatic institutional authority was not the same as disappearing. A former queen could remain visible. She could remain respected. She could continue contributing to public life. What she would not automatically have was another official power center beside the monarch. That was the line William and Catherine wanted to draw. Camilla looked toward Catherine. There was tension between them, but Catherine did not appear pleased. She had no reason to celebrate. She had already accepted that the same rule could one day apply to her. Catherine explained that if George became king after William, she would accept the same limits. No separate court. No inherited authority over employees. No permanent institutional voice beside George simply because she had once been queen. For the first time, Camilla stopped asking what she would lose. She began asking what the rule actually said. Would it apply to every future consort? Could a future king change it? Was it written only for widowed queens? William and Catherine had anticipated those questions. And then William turned the page. The second sheet changed everything. Camilla expected to see her name. Instead, she saw something much larger. The rule applied to every future surviving consort. Catherine was included. And future royal spouses would face the same principle. Even George's future wife would be protected by it. If Charlotte ever became monarch, the same basic idea could still apply to the person who had previously stood beside her. This was not a private agreement about Camilla. It was a framework for future reigns. The institutional household would end with the reign that created it. A former consort could still be invited to continue official duties. They could retain selected patronages. They could attend important events. They could support causes connected to the monarchy. But those responsibilities would need to be renewed. They would not survive automatically just because they existed before. Camilla read the second page more slowly. The meaning was now impossible to miss. She had not been singled out. The rule had been designed to survive her. And that made it far more powerful. Part 3 of 3. There was another person William had consulted before bringing the proposal to Windsor. Princess Anne. She had lived through more than one royal transition. She had watched the Queen Mother remain an important figure. She had seen how a former generation could continue to carry influence long after a new monarch had taken the throne. William wanted to know whether ending that automatic continuity would weaken the monarchy. Anne's answer focused on one thing: the crown. A different reign meant a different family structure. The next monarch needed the freedom to rule. That did not mean former royals had to become invisible. Respect could remain. Family ties could remain. Public service could remain. But automatic authority did not have to remain with them. That gave William exactly what he needed. The proposal did not have to erase history. It only had to stop history from becoming an automatic command. The Queen Mother model had worked in its own time. That did not mean every future reign had to repeat it. Charles looked at the names on the second page again. For the first time that evening, He seemed to be reading the document not simply as Camilla's husband, but as the monarch. The question had moved beyond one woman. It had moved beyond Clarence House. It was now about what kind of institution the monarchy would become for George and the generations after him. Camilla had one final concern. Could a future king reverse the principle? The answer was careful. Any monarch would ultimately shape their own household. The document was not meant to control George. It was meant to establish an expectation. No previous royal household would automatically have a claim over the next one. If George wanted Camilla involved, he could invite her. If he wanted her to continue certain duties, he could allow it. She could remain important. But her importance would come from the new sovereign's decision, not from an inherited institutional right. That distinction was everything. Camilla could still have a meaningful place, but she could not automatically demand one. Eventually, Charles closed the folder. The meeting seemed finished. Camilla stood. Catherine followed. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. There was no dramatic confrontation, no angry exchange, no public declaration. But Charles asked William to stay behind. The door closed. Now it was only father and son. And the next question had nothing to do with Camilla. Charles asked William whether he had truly considered what this rule would mean for Catherine. William did not hesitate. He had. Charles pressed the point. Could William really accept a future in which Catherine, after years of public service and after being loved by the country, would lose the automatic machinery of the crown if George became king? Could he imagine her without a separate household? Without inherited staff? Without an institutional voice? William looked toward the door. His answer was simple. Catherine understood the cost. And she had chosen the principle anyway. That mattered. She was not supporting a rule because she wanted to take something away from Camilla. She supported it because she believed George should inherit the crown without also inheriting a second center of authority built around his mother. William had experienced the loss of a parent himself. He understood what it meant for a young heir to lose someone they loved. But he also understood that love and institutional power could not be allowed to become the same thing. That was the difficult balance Catherine was asking the monarchy to accept. A mother could remain a mother. A former queen could remain respected. A widow could remain part of the family. But the crown belonged to the reigning monarch. The following morning, Friday, August 14th, William and Catherine reviewed the final wording. The language remained deliberately neutral. Diana was not mentioned. Charles was not criticized. Camilla was not named as a target. There was no language about punishment or removal. The central principle remained the same. One ruler, one court, one working household at the beginning of the next reign. William signed first. Then he turned the document toward Catherine. She read the wording one more time. Then she signed beside him. 2 signatures. One decision. But there was no celebration. Because both understood what they had written. The rule could one day limit them too. That was what made it difficult to dismiss. The history behind the decision was also impossible to ignore. The Queen Mother had remained one of the most recognizable figures in the monarchy long after her husband's reign ended. Clarence House had become part of that history. Her continued public role had shown that a former royal consort could remain important for decades. William and Catherine were not saying that history was wrong. They were saying it should not automatically control the future. Camilla could remain Charles's widow. She could remain part of the family. She could continue causes important to her. She could appear wherever the reigning monarch chose to include her. But Charles's institutional framework would not automatically pass to William. And Catherine had placed herself under exactly the same rule. That was the detail that changed everything. Because popularity would not create an exception. History would not create an exception. A long marriage would not create an exception. And being the mother of the next monarch would not create an exception. The next sovereign would inherit the crown. They would also inherit the freedom to decide how their own household operated. Charles had entered Windsor expecting to discuss future staffing and planning. Instead, he had been forced to imagine a future where his reign was over. William's reign had begun, and Camilla's institutional position depended on the monarch who came after him. But one question remained unanswered. Clarence House. That residence had been at the center of the Queen Mother era. It had carried decades of history and public activity. William's proposal clearly challenged the assumption that its old role would automatically continue. But would Clarence House itself become part of the new rule? Or could it remain connected to a former consort without becoming a second royal headquarters? That question was still hanging over the entire proposal. And that is why the Windsor meeting may have been more important than it first appeared. The real decision was never simply whether Camilla would keep a household. It was whether the monarchy would continue carrying old structures forward because they had existed before, or whether every new reign would begin with a clean line between the past and the future. For Charles, that line was deeply personal. For William, it was about the monarchy George would one day inherit. And for Catherine, it was about something even more difficult. She was willing to accept the same future she was asking Camilla to accept. No automatic second court. No inherited institutional power. No permanent machinery simply because she had once stood beside the sovereign. Family could continue. Respect could continue. Public service could continue. But the crown would move forward with the person who actually wore it. And that left one final question hanging over Clarence House. If the next reign truly begins with only one working court, what happens to the house that once symbolized the Queen Mother's enduring place in royal life? Because if Clarence House becomes part of the new rule, then this is no longer just a change in staffing. It becomes one of the clearest breaks yet between the old royal model and the monarchy William intends to build.